I really think this is a remarkable point in American history. You have an administration whose policies are wrong on national security grounds, they're wrong on American job-creating grounds, and they're wrong on cost of living. And let me explain what I mean. This is the most anti-American energy administration that we've ever had. And the consequence is you have the highest cost of gasoline in American history. And I think that if you're an editorial writer at the New York Times and you live in a high-rise in Manhattan and you ride the subway to work, it may not occur to you that for most Americans, a high price of gasoline is a real problem, because in fact you don't drive. But if you are the rest of the country, a high price of gasoline and as a consequence of diesel fuel and of heating oil and so forth has a lot of effects. It affects the cost of groceries because everything that's delivered by truck is more expensive. It affects the cost of everything made of plastic. It affects the underlying cost structure for people. I had a woman who came to an event in Nevada, who is in Nevada, Iowa, in Nevada, who said to me that she was rationed to 2 trips a week, and I was one of her 2 trips. So let me just start at the most practical level. This administration, the Obama administration's high-price, anti-American model is very dangerous and very destructive. Let me put it in context. Just the news of the last 48 or 72 hours. You have an Egyptian government which is threatening to try American hostages, almost an exact repeat of the Jimmy Carter weakness of 1979-1980 with the Iranian hostage crisis. You have a Pakistani government which has arrested the doctor who helped us find bin Laden. Instead of praising the person who helped us find the most wanted terrorist in the world, they've arrested him for cooperating with the United States. You have an Iranian government which has been practicing how to close the Straits of Hormuz, which would skyrocket the price of gasoline and the price of oil. Faced with all that, a rational, serious American government would have a crash program on American energy and would say our goal is to become so independent of the Middle East that we actually don't care what they do. And I have a very simple formula for that. If you want to measure what our goal is, it is to ensure that no American president ever again bows to a Saudi king. Now, how do we do that? Well, we fundamentally replace whole bureaucracies. I am for closing the Environmental Protection Agency and replacing it with a brand new Environmental Solutions Agency with brand new people. The Environmental Solutions Agency would have to have as a first test common sense. And you can talk to any farmer anywhere in America about the proposed dust regulations, and you'll have an initial idea of what I mean by common sense. I was in Arizona recently, and they said they had this meeting with an EPA executive who was explaining to them that EPA has control over particulate matter in the air because of the Clean Air Act, and that dust was a particulate matter, and that they were considerably concerned about the fact that in Arizona you get dust storms, and that this is a sign that something is going wrong. And so they were out there to try to figure out. And he said, example, could you, during certain parts of the year, could you water the areas that produce the dust storms? And these guys said to him, you know, Arizona is a desert. And it's called a desert because we don't have much water. But they said, literally, this was the kind of dialogue underway. So start out, one, we should have an Environmental Solutions Agency which has common sense, which has to take into account economics in making its decisions, which has a collaborative attitude towards state and local government rather than a dictatorial attitude, and which encourages entrepreneurs and incentives to solve problems with new and better solutions, not with red tape, litigation, and lawsuits. So that would be a help. Second, we should fundamentally overhaul the Department of the Interior. You know, the Obama administration very cleverly said that they were going to lift the moratorium on the Gulf and replace it with a permitting system, and they wouldn't issue any permits. But there was no moratorium. You just had to apply for a permit, which they wouldn't give you, but the permit system was there, so it wasn't a moratorium. And I was in New Orleans recently. I mean, people are so angry about this. People say whatever irritation they felt with BP was replaced by how angry they are at the Obama administration. And remember, these are $80,000 a year jobs off the coast of Louisiana. So in an economy that has economic problems, these are pretty good jobs. And I thought it was a sign. I think the administration was so out of touch with reality, they did not realize that these really big deep water rigs move. And so they thought they could put a moratorium out, score political points, although their expert panel had advised against having a moratorium, said it was exactly the wrong policy. But they did this political moratorium. The first rig that moved went to Egypt, taking $80,000 a year jobs and all the royalties that would have been paid to the government for the oil that would have been produced. But the second rig to move really, I thought, was the best. The guy who was in charge of the company was obviously a hardcore conservative. And he issued a press release that said, because of political instability in the United States, we are now going to drill off the Congo. So take that example. Now let me give you one more example. At a time of high unemployment, at a time when we need more American energy to be safer in the world market, the president vetoes the Keystone Pipeline. Now, think about this. This kills 30 to 50,000 construction jobs. It kills jobs in Houston and Galveston processing the oil and shipping it for probably 50 years. And it blocks the U.S. from having a pipeline bringing oil which we could use in a crisis if we had, in fact, a problem in the Middle East. The Canadians are now seriously looking at a partnership with China to build the pipeline due west across the Rockies to Vancouver. And what I've said is, I am committed, if I end up as President of the United States, on the very first day, I will sign an executive order allowing the construction of the Keystone Pipeline so that Canada can have an American partner on January 20th, not a Chinese partner. Let me make two other general points about energy, and I'm focusing on oil and gas just because it is so central to the future of the system. I want to make two more points about oil and gas and then one point about electricity. The fact is, we should allow, and I would as president immediately issue executive orders opening up federal land both for oil and gas and for minerals. When you realize that the U.S. government operates 85% of Nevada, and that the Bureau of Land Management does not want to allow any development, has a deep bias against development. Remember, the reason North Dakota has 3.5% unemployment and has had 7 straight tax cuts at the state government level is because the oil was on private land. If North Dakota had been public land, we would have no idea how big the Bakken Formation is. It turns out the Bakken Formation is 25 times, not 25%, 2,500% bigger than the U.S. Geological Survey thought it was. So the volume of oil available and gas available in North Dakota is staggeringly bigger than anybody thought 10 years ago. We would know none of that if it had not been on private land. I am dedicated to opening up federal lands, again, not national parks, not scenic areas, but take Alaska. We own 69% of Alaska. As I remind Governor Perry, Alaska is twice the size of Texas. And he flinches, but he's a good sport. 69% of Alaska is approximately 1.5 Texases. So So you could give the environmentalists a half of Texas. Pick their favorite glaciers, their favorite polar bears, whatever they want. And you would have an area the size of Texas that you could open up. Now, the largest coal reserves in the United States are in Alaska. The Chukchi Sea alone, not Anwar, the Chukchi Sea is a basin that is estimated to have as much oil and gas as the entire Gulf of Mexico. So our potential as a country, we have more, when you count all sources of energy, we have more energy in the United States than any other country, more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than China. And yet we have a government which has, for the last 40 years, been more and more and more anti-energy. And so I am for fundamentally and profoundly changing it. The last point I want to make about oil and gas, and this is true of all energy systems, but just take oil and gas, which takes a fair amount of money to explore, a fair amount of money to develop, a fair amount of money to build the pipelines. The tax program, you can see, if you go to newt.org, you'll see a tax program designed to create jobs. The key things from the standpoint of energy development are, first, we have zero capital gains tax, so hundreds of billions of dollars will pour into the U.S. because we will be the best place in the world to invest. Second, we have a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is the Irish tax rate. That makes us even better than Canada, which is at 16%. It liberates about $700 billion in profits, which are locked up overseas today, that would come home. It allows our companies to compete successfully worldwide. And ironically, for our liberal friends, it means General Electric would actually pay taxes. But maybe the most important thing for the development of oil and gas and minerals is we have 100% expensing. This also affects farmers. We have 100% expensing, which means any new equipment you buy, you write off in 1 year. The goal is to make the American worker the most productive, most modern workforce in the world. We combine with that a new reform of the unemployment compensation system so that if you want to draw unemployment compensation, you have to sign up with a business for a training program so you're actually learning something during the period while we are paying you, but we will never again pay anyone 99 weeks for doing nothing. Let me say finally, I am for an all-source system of energy. I think it is so vital for our economy. I mean, if you keep $500 billion a year at home, you're going to create millions of new jobs. It is so vital for our national security, and it's so vital for our standard of living. This is a country built around inexpensive energy. And to have the Environmental Protection Agency, at the time when we have the most expensive gasoline we've ever had, they actually have a proposal that would add 25 cents a gallon. That's how out of touch with reality the Obama administration is. So I'm for developing every American source of energy. And my last comment is about electricity. The EPA's current proposals for electricity are going to close so many plants that we're actually going to start having brownouts because of our own government. This is the kind of thing we have to stop. I look forward very much to your questions, and I really appreciate being here.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. We do have planned to have the moderators here each pose one question to you, and I would like to begin first, because I do have the microphone. I want to applaud the idea of abolishing the EPA. Colorado Farm Bureau and American Farm Bureau would very much support that. I would also like for you to consider a very drastic need, and that is considering the Endangered Species Act as part of that problem. Beyond that, though, one of our concerns is fuel taxes. The Obama administration has proposed, in addition, an increase to those fuel taxes, and that is very troubling to particularly agricultural producers and folks in the West who, have to travel large distances every day. Those fuel taxes would be very controversial for us, be complicating to our life. What would you propose in other ways to perhaps bring revenue into the Treasury out of, in fact, energy production?
Well, this actually is a very good question. Let me say in passing, I strongly support saving endangered species. I also strongly support common sense. When you're told, for example, that the largest basin in the lower 48 may be closed down for development, because there may be a species of lizard that is so endangered that it covers thousands of square miles. If you just say to yourself, let me get this straight. There are so few of them that we're going to close down thousands of square miles, in which case there must be so many of them because they cover thousands of square miles. I mean, it can't be, what's happened is the environmentalists that really have been infiltrated over the last 40 years by people on the left who are against business and they're against local control, and they use the environment as the excuse. So that just on that topic, for a much more common sense application, I am for endangered species being preserved, but I do think there has to be a pretty high level of common sense applied to that mission. I would like to see a substantial amount. Imagine for a minute that we had $500 billion a year being produced of oil and gas in the United States instead of being imported. The royalty effect of that for the federal government, the royalty effect of that for the federal government would be remarkable. And I would like to see 2/3 of the royalties go to pay down the deficit. I managed to. I have the sneezers. Forgive me for sneezing. 2/3 ought to go to pay down the deficit, but I'd like to see 1/3 of it turn towards infrastructure and turns towards developing what we need to be competitive with China and India, and that would have things like those kind of fees. So I would like to see a displacement towards royalties displacing fees, but also a displacement towards royalties enabling us to rebuild our infrastructure. I don't know what the case in Colorado, but I can tell you that in Iowa, the number of county and state bridges that are now beginning to be inadequate is very significant. And part of it is that as farm production has improved and as we get a lot more, for example, with corn, we get dramatically bigger yields per acre, we're actually carrying more tonnage over these bridges than they were designed for 30 years ago. And so you really are going to have a nationwide challenge of redesigning and reinvesting. And I'd like to see some kind of break where maybe 2/3 of the new royalties would go towards the debt and 1/3 would go towards infrastructure rebuilding.
Thank you for joining us here today in Colorado on behalf of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. We really appreciate your support of energy issues and your interest therein. I think, as you may be aware, the United States has over a 100-year supply of clean-burning domestic natural gas. And the development of these resources could be potentially transformative, both for economic development, energy security, and environmental quality. Now, you've been a strong supporter of free markets. And in that context, what do you see as the proper role of government in guiding the development of domestic energy resources, from renewables and biofuels to using natural gas as transportation fuel, as a feedstock for manufacturing and chemical industry, reducing emissions, or exports of LNG to buyers in other countries?
Well, it's a very good question. Let me just say two quick things about the supply of natural gas. First of all, this is a perfect case study in why liberals are so consistently wrong in their effort to project reality. The reason you've had an explosion in the volume of natural gas that's available is we've taken a technology that was developed for offshore, which enables us to go down thousands of feet in one hole and go out 4 miles in every direction. This was not designed for shale production of natural gas in the continent. It was designed offshore, where it's very expensive to have these big rigs. And so the more production you get out of one of these rigs, the bigger your return on the investment. Somebody figured out about a decade ago that model could work on land. And all of a sudden, shale, we've always known there was gas in shale, but we thought it was not economically recoverable. Suddenly they applied what was originally an ocean-going technology to shale in the United States, particularly, I think, starting in western Pennsylvania. And we suddenly went from, I think, a 7-year projected supply about 8 years ago to a 100-plus year supply, which is probably an understatement. Just to give you that side story, because We are a dynamic society of constant innovation. There is no peak oil. There is no peak gas. Those are terms used by the left to justify telling the rest of us we have to have austerity so they can control our lives on behalf of a theory. I am opposed to that. I want to unleash the American people in order to have us produce. Now, I do believe in shaping the market in exactly the sense that Alexander Hamilton described in the first report on manufacturers. So, for example, we have always allowed depletion on oil wells, which is a particular form of tax break that affects oil wells. We have a variety of tax breaks all of you use in a variety of different ways, depending on what business you're in. The difference between that and what Obama does is he wants the bureaucracy to pick winners and losers. I mean, it's one thing to say anybody who wants to go out and find oil gets a certain write-off. So for example, I want to shape the system in favor of manufacturing by allowing 100% write-off of all new equipment every year. Now, this favors farming, it favors manufacturing, it rebuilds the American industry in terms of producing machine tools. All of a sudden, you're going to have a boom in investment. But we're shaping the market. What I don't want to do is I don't want to have some bureaucrat decide between company A and company B. I mean, if they were good venture capitalists, they wouldn't be getting a GS-15 salary. So I am deeply opposed to government. And by the way, this is why when I recently proposed that we have a bold new approach in space, I didn't actually propose any extra money. I propose taking the money that NASA currently wastes, using it as incentives to see how many $1 billion we could get out of the private sector to compete for prizes. Not to pick winners and losers, except to say, if you get to the moon first, here's some money. And how would we know you got to the moon? Because you'd be on the moon. It would be fairly obvious. You wouldn't have to have 5 of Obama's friends go to the White House for a private meeting to say, can we pretend we got to the moon? We need the money. And so there's a huge difference between setting a marketplace and then letting everybody compete, which I'm in favor of. Remember that Lindbergh flew to Paris by himself for $25,000. There was a prize. So there are lots of ways to shape the market. The first report on that is Alexander Hamilton's first report on manufacturers, which I believe is 1790.
Great. Mr. Speaker, as you mentioned, we are looking right now at record high gasoline and diesel prices, and they are projected to go even higher in 2012. With Keystone XL is a great place to try and change policy to bring those down. What other steps would you take to help lower gas and diesel prices?
Well, on the first day that I'm sworn in, there'll be a series of executive orders. One I've already mentioned is the Keystone Pipeline. One will lift all the restrictions in the Gulf of Mexico and will enable people to start developing the Gulf of Mexico. And remember, there's an interesting little lag here. You win the election in November. I tell everybody, you want to know when the economy is going to start recovering? About 9 o'clock at night on Election Day, when people figure out that he's gone. They're going to go, the mood's going to be, Obama's gone, I think I'll hire somebody. And people will say, or I think I'll go make an investment. So the very first day, I will ask the Congress, and I'll campaign on this, and I'll ask anybody who's on my ticket to campaign on, the Congress staying in session on January 3rd to repeal 3 bills. I want them to repeal Obamacare in its entirety. I want them to repeal Dodd-Frank, which is killing small banks and killing small business. And I want them to repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, which has added red tape to no advantage. I want all 3 of those on my desk when I'm sworn in, so I can sign them the first day to get off to a positive start. And then we'll have a whole series of executive orders. Those executive orders will begin to open up how the Department of Interior deals with offshore drilling, how we deal with federal lands, how we deal with the Gulf of Mexico, and my goal would be to send such a powerful signal. All of these will be published by October 1st. So everybody who's in the oil and gas industry is going to know on election night. These things are all coming on January 20th. which means they will begin moving. The exploration industry will start moving. People will start moving because people move on the expectation of future behavior. So my guess is, and the market in oil responds to future projections pretty widely. I mean, $20, $30, $40 a barrel. My guess is Reagan did this. This is his birthday, by the way. So he's 101 years old today. And the first executive order Reagan signed deregulated gasoline. Some of you are old enough, you'll remember we had rationing on alternate days, and you had to sign. You know, if your license plate was an odd or even number, you had days that were designated to buy gasoline on. And Reagan signed deregulation as his first executive order. The price of gasoline fell within 6 months. And so I think it's fair to say you would probably see gasoline prices starting to fall pretty dramatically as people realize that we were going to bring supply online.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We understand that we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, we have some microphones here, don't we, or not? Please. Start right here. Gentleman in baseball cap, go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, welcome to Golden, Colorado. I wonder, do you believe in human-induced climate change?
I say, by the way, in terms of being welcome to Golden, Callista, my wife Callista, who's over here, saw the Coors sign and was happy all the way driving through. So we're glad to be here. I believe we don't know. I'm an amateur paleontologist. The planet has changed its temperature a number of times. Callista and I were at the Field Museum in Chicago at Labor Day looking at dinosaurs from the Antarctic. If you look at the Antarctic today, you'll figure it must be a lot warmer when the dinosaurs were there. So what I've said in the past is I'm happy to take prudent measures that aren't very expensive. So if we can find ways to have relatively inexpensive, safe nuclear power, I'm for it. The fact that Iowa produces 20% of its energy from wind, of its electricity from wind, is fine. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do at the margin. What I would not do is I would not turn power over to the bureaucracy to run the entire country. I have always opposed cap and trade, and I want to be clear because many of you have seen it or you'll see ads about it. The ad I did with Nancy Pelosi is the dumbest single thing I've done in the last 5 or 6 years. They're just stupid, okay? But I did not say at any point in that ad that I was in favor of cap and trade. In fact, when Gore testified in favor of it, I testified against it the same day. You can go to newt.org and see the videotape of the testimony. I always tell people, even if you thought it was true, that doesn't mean the only answer is avoidance. You know, the Dutch have been faced with the ocean for a long time. They did not adopt an Al Gore approach of lowering the sea. They built dikes. So there are lots of ways to solve problems that don't involve institutionalized stupidity.
Thank you. Right here, close to the front. We'll take one more question at least. Thank you.
Speaker Gingrich.
Wait. On there, please. Thank you.
Speaker Gingrich. Just a little comment, and then the question. The regulations seem to go hand in hand with energy and the high cost of energy. And before we get too far, you need to be aware that milk isn't a hazardous spill, and it took an enormous effort by ag industry and dairy industry to convince the director of EPA of such a fact. It wasn't a light that went on in the Obama administration. It was a lot of effort from agriculture to convince them against this. And the other question with regulation, it's one thing to develop new energies and create new energies and the like, which was all needed, but it's also important to conserve the energies we have. An example being there is the trucking industry, and a lot of those supporting the truck. Matter of fact, 200 industries have worked with the Department of Transportation trying to change regulations which would up the weight limits on semis for the large over-the-road trucks to 97,000 pounds. Well, there were more axles, so they were just as safe. It's almost a 20% increase in the load, so that's that many less trucks going to be on the road. But no, they decided to table this for further study, not realizing, I guess, that it came through it's been studied in a pilot program in the Northeast, and it's very helpful out here in the United States, in this part of the country where the majority of our stuff travels by truck, and it just makes sense. Where would you stand on this?
Where would I stand on regulations that don't make sense? I'm a conservative. And if I were a liberal, I'd be for regulations that don't make sense because that would make sense to me. But let me draw a distinction. I mean, the milk one was always one of those fascinating moments of it, but so is the milk and dust are very similar in their irrationality. But I want to make 2 points, one of which some of you may think you may not agree with me, but I want to say it up front. I'm not against all regulation. When I taught environmental studies, the Cuyahoga River had caught fire in downtown Cleveland. I tell my most conservative friends, it is not a good sign when you have enough pollution that a river is catching fire. And so some of what we've done, we had Copper Hill, Tennessee, where literally the sulfuric acid had burned off all of the trees for several miles around the smelter. I mean, these were things that were real in the 1960s. So some level, this is why I don't want to abolish EPA and have nothing. I want to have a brand new environmental solutions agency because there are things all of us want done. And there are certain limits to what we're willing to see done to the environment. One of the reasons I'm different, and one of the reasons that Clist and I decided to run, knowing how hard it would be and knowing how nasty some of the attacks would be. We've had Republican presidents. We've had Republican presidents with a Republican Congress. They didn't change EPA. They slowed down the rate of decay, but they didn't change. The same bureaucrats in the same offices generating the same regulations year after year. And that's why, after having studied it for a long time, and I think there's a virtue sometimes to actually having somebody who knows what they're doing. We've tried 3 years of an amateur and it hasn't been all that good an experience. I think you've got to actually replace the agency if you're going to make it work. Because I think the people in the agency are committed to a worldview that is incompatible both with our local freedoms and with free enterprise. So I'm running as a candidate of very big solutions. I mean, a Gingrich presidency would be very controversial because we would actually take on the Washington establishment and we'd actually fight for very profound, very fundamental change in a way that I don't think any of the other candidates has begun to even think about that scale of change.
Thank you. We understand that we do have one more burning question we'd like to have you ask. Right over here.
Mr. Speaker, I'm representing a German company in the renewable energy field. We have developed some very unique systems in the solar field, wind turbines and commercial-grade storage batteries and electric vehicle charging stations. We came to Colorado 2 years ago. We invested millions of dollars of our money. We haven't taken one dime from the federal government, but we do have a situation now where events like the Solyndra event has put a little dent on that, what I consider to be very positive development. Would you agree to have a federally mandated feed-in program for renewable energy? Because that's exactly what it took in Germany to spawn over 3,000 companies that did not exist before the federal government mandated a feed-in program.
No, I wouldn't. Let me tell you why. A mandate has no cost attached to it. So you have no, I mean, if you watch California where they do these things all the time, they are destroying business in California. And they're destroying the cost of living. What I'm prepared to do is be for a long-term permanent tax credit so you'd have stability of your investment decisions. It is utterly irrational for the Congress to pass 2- and 3-year tax credits because you get no capital investment, you get no long-term stability. And so I'm happy to shape, and I recognize in advance, I'm shaping part of the energy environment to favor the growth of new technology, new science, which we've done for all of history. We subsidized the airmail in the 1930s in order to get an airlines industry. It was a conscious effort to create a brand new industry. But we subsidized the airmail for any company that could carry it. We didn't pick, one company or another. So I would say to you, I would be very happy to talk with you about how to have a long-term stable tax credit that you could count on that would make it rational to compete. But I don't want to go to an arbitrary, no-cost attached mandate system in which you end up with technologies that are totally economically incompatible with reality but can be legally imposed because they fit some kind of formula. I think that's an invitation both to waste on the part of the new technologies and to really lowering the standard of living for the people who have to pay for it. Okay. Am I done? Well, let me just say one brief political commercial. If you decide you want very large change in Washington, and you think having somebody who helped balance the budget for 4 years, helped pass welfare reform, helped create the first majority in 40 years, helped Reagan in a program that created 16 million jobs, and then worked with Clinton on a program that created 11 million jobs in 4 years, if that makes sense to you, I would ask you when you go home today on Facebook, Twitter, email, telephone, even to show I'm old-fashioned, face-to-face, to encourage people to vote for me tomorrow. I'm very thrilled to be here. I'm delighted to have a chance to chat with you about a very, very important topic, and I hope you have a very, very good afternoon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.